the meeting to order. For the purposes of the recording, I'm going to introduce myself, Bruce Zuloff, Director of the Auto Industry Division and Executive Secretary to the Motor Vehicle Dealer Board. Today's date is Thursday. No, today's date's not Thursday. It's Tuesday, September 11th. The time is 9:02. This is the second meeting of the 2018 rulemaking agenda that we refer to as Group 2. We'll follow the posted agenda. We'll do welcome and instructions. We'll review the discussion, the process, including the group discussion guidelines. Then we'll get into the scope of this meeting, which is a review of what we accomplished in the first meeting of Group 2 and some of the proposed changes that came out of that Mtg and Mr. Jones have worked on. And then if anybody from the public comes in later, we'll take some time for public comments. With that, as always, for the recorded version, I'd like everybody to introduce themselves for the record, and going to my right.
Well, that's a first, Bruce. I'm Leland Beebe. I'm the Legal Assistant to the Auto Industry Division and the Motor Vehicle Dealer Board.
Bradford Jones from the Colorado Attorney General's Office. I represent the Auto Industry Division and Motor Vehicle Dealer Board.
Criddell-Tapanen, meeting recorder.
Gary Booth, Power Sports Dealers.
Beth Spellerberg, Deputy Executive Secretary for the Auto Industry Division.
Matthew Rhodes, Colorado Auto Dealers Association.
Michael Domermuth here on behalf of the Colorado Automobile Dealers Association.
Todd O'Connell from the Colorado Independent Automobile Dealers Association.
Frank Eagles, Supervisory Investigator, Auto Industry Division.
John Opeka, I'm the Supervisory Investigator with the Auto Industry Division.
Chris Hartman, Agent in Charge, Auto Industry Division.
Joshua Dexter, Supervising Investigator for Auto Industry Division.
Thank you. As always, please silence your phones if they are on ring, and also just for the purposes of the recorded record, try not to talk over the top of each other. Obviously, we try to observe professional courtesy, let the speaker make the point, and then if you have a counterpoint, then weigh in at that point in time. I don't think I need to do anything further. I think we can jump right into what Mr. Beebe and what Mr. Jones have done to redraft some of the rules that came out, some of the discussions that came out of the Year 2 first meeting. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Mr. Beebe and Mr. Jones to go through what they have done.
Thank you, Mr. Zuloff, and welcome everybody. When we picked this date on the calendar, we didn't have much choice. In fact, we had no choice. But I think we realized the somberness of this moment in our history. I just wanted to let you know that we didn't have a choice, but it's also, to me, seemingly somewhat appropriate that we're gathered in a governmental activity in support of a process that is a big tent process in which everything that is the American way is being used as part of that process. And 9/11 and its horrors did not eradicate that. And I just wanted to make that comment. We've got someone who just came in the door. We need to get him to...
Would you identify yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm Randall Miles from Pikes Peak Travel Land. We're an RV dealer down in Colorado Springs. Sorry for the late. I was sitting in the room over there waiting.
All right.
What was your last name again?
I'm sorry, Miles is B as in Bravo, I-L-E-S.
Thank you.
I'm going to pass this on, Bruce. I'll finish signing it later. Okay, we were just beginning, Mr. Biles. Okay, and at this point, I was going to get into the purpose of this meeting. It's to finalize the proposed changes to the set of rules in the 2018 Rule Group 2 set of rules. In the hope that, of course, these will be promulgated soon through the board, but that's a meeting process yet to come. Just as the earlier discussion in this rule group proceeded, this will proceed through the rule group pairs that had already been set out. And those are, of course, the pairs that work with Motor V and work with Power Sports, to the extent that those all apply. And at the conclusion of the last meeting, Mr. Jones and I met several times to work on revised drafts in order to respond to the suggestions that were made. And they were very good suggestions to change certain language and to improve the drafts as they were presented last time. We did endeavor to make these changes as clear and concise as possible within the language norms that are used in the statutory and regulatory drafting of the modern era. Now, as requested by the group, we also provided those of you that were here the blast email to all of you with a so-called red line version, which, as you saw in the email, I explained was amplified as using a tracking technique, which hopefully proved to be useful to you to see both the changes and to also see at the same moment the structured text as it has now been drafted. If anyone does not have a copy of that, Ms. Spellerberg can provide you a copy at this point so that, okay. You have one, sir?
Yes, I do.
Okay,
Thank you.
good. All right. Now, I'm going to direct the attention of the group to the changed language in these statutes, or in these rules as we proceed. Of course, every change carries with it the change of the context itself. So I think everyone needs to be aware that because we're saying we're looking just at the change does not mean that if you feel it is in some way affecting that context and may need further change, then, please, when the discussion takes place, advance those points. As you saw in the materials that I sent out, there were those two rules that the group basically approved without any expression of needed change. Now, one of them was the merger rule itself, and the other one was simple. So, but that does not mean if you have a comment regarding those, that that's closed. At the end of the presentation today, if you want to open that discussion up again, you certainly may. But right now as it stands, if there is no opening of that, then those will be as they were. Okay. So with that in mind, I want to move us right away into rule pair number 1. And in rule pair number 1, there were some major changes in terms of the structure, and those seem to be necessitated by the need for clarity of definitions and limitations, and to ensure that certain of the exceptions, if you will, to the generality were very clearly expressed. Okay. Now, as you may recall, the comments that were raised involved a multiple set of things. One of them was the potential unfairness of a 15-mile or 1,500-mile bright line related to RVs or motor homes, and that is due to the transit use that occurs in that industry, in that the vehicles are driven from a point of origin to this area for sale, and that could well exceed the 1,500 miles, making every single one of them that is in that event an automatically used vehicle with that bright line test. So that was one point that was made. And another point that was kind of an interesting point was that the manufacturer's statement of origin, which most of us use as a terminology, MSO, is also sometimes called a manufacturer's certificate of origin, an MCO. Title 42, for example, does have an explicit statement in it, and that's the titles and regs section of our legislative materials in the end of the hall down there. It basically says these are the same. Therefore, it was prudent probably to state that in this as well. And so that was added. We looked also to a terminology which is the term transferred, and that one, I will be frank with you, Mr. Jones and I struggled with, because there's something very arcane about the wording of that kind of process. We know what it is meant to express, and that a dealer at the point of receipt of a vehicle has an MSO or MCO for that vehicle, and may want to just hand that off to another dealer who is authorized as a franchisor to do the sale for that, and not be penalized for that. But we're not wedded to that language, but this was a struggle to make sure that we express something there that the industry could use and we could use to encapsulate that. Okay, so that sort of brings us back around. Those are the set of changes that were made to that particular proposed rule from last meeting. There was a threshold issue raised within the last 24 hours by a significant voice in the industry. And that threshold question has to do with the legality or potential illegality of a exception to the 1,500 mile bright line. The question was, is it acceptable to do this by rule, by this board, or must it be done by statutory change, which is legislative? And so I'm going to defer to Mr. Jones to address that question.
So I did not have any direct communication. I was I was filled in on the issue by Mr. Beebe. But basically, what we were thinking when we created these two provisions that are listed out in the proposed change is the first one is recognizing what the stakeholders collectively discussed last time, and what was in that preceding regulation that we are now modifying, and that is the 1,500 miles. As we discussed last time, the 1,500 miles is guidance that we are taking from Title 42. Ms. Rouse, who's now present, Ms. Rouse indicated that this is something that the board and I believe the division have kind of referenced in the past, and we're using that as guidance, and specifically that is the definition of new vehicle laid out in 42-6-102 provision 11. Additionally, there was issues and a consideration raised by Mr. O'Connell regarding motorhome. After the meeting, Mr. Beebe and I turned to the definitions of motorhome, and we found a definition in 24-32-902 7 of the Colorado Revised Statutes. And we used that as the basis of defining motorhome. And based on the discussion from last stakeholder meeting, we took the 3,500 miles as the basis for saying if it's under that amount, then it qualifies as a new motor vehicle. And that is based on the information that we received, and that was also raised by some of the division staff, where individuals are transporting these vehicles from the East Coast of the United States, but they can't transport the vehicles, they actually have to drive them here. We believe both of these definitions clearly fall within the board. I believe it clearly falls within the board's authority, because if you look at the definition of new motor vehicle under 12.6.102, provision 21, it says it says that a new motor vehicle means a motor vehicle that has been transferred on a manufacturer's statement of origin and that has sufficiently low mileage to be considered new as determined by the board. And that's what we are engaged in the process, is creating proposed regulations that we can present to the board to make that final determination. But I believe it is clearly within the board's authority to create exceptions based on the information and the information that's coming from the industry that necessitates exception to the majority kind of rule. So that is the basis of that. Another issue that was raised was whether this could be tied over to power sports. And that was raised this morning. One thing that I think I just wanted to state on the record is that to the extent that there's any regulation that's created for power sports, I believe it would just be the number 4, section 4 of this proposed change. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Mr. Beebe.
Yeah.
I have a comment for discussion at the appropriate time.
Okay. So we're getting there.
Yeah. We're not there yet?
No, not quite. It's interesting as a legal question because if you look at Title 42 and you look at the lead line for 42's definitions in this titling section, it basically invites even the motor V titling people to consider exceptions. Now, they may never have done that, but it does not preclude them by definition from doing that. The door is open. It talks about the part 1, the title part, the definitions being limited to that, number 1. But number 2, it basically says, there can be exceptional circumstances. And when the definition would not apply. So they have some discretion to develop rules that would allow the same thing that this board might allow with this exception. And it would essentially mean that if it was propounded here, and the board went with that, it would then be in their court and in their authority to parallel that. We don't know, I will stress this right now, we don't know how this has been handled, because it hasn't come up here in a direct way, how all of this has been handled down at that section. When someone has come in the door with a vehicle that has been driven that distance and has tried to present it as a new vehicle. So I'm hoping, Mr. Biles, you'll probably be able to chime in on that one. Okay.
That was one of the rude awakenings when we bought the dealership back in 1982, because motorhomes are driven from the manufacturer to the dealership. And so, but as you indicated now, I have a better understanding, because we would submit when the mileage was different than what we normally would see, we would just simply attach an affidavit with the title application, and the titling group would accept that. And so that you basically answered the question as to why that happened, but it worked quite smoothly, as long as we did provide the documentation up front, and it saved it from being sent back.
Okay. So, in fact, this has not been a problem.
If the dealer were proactive and understood what was going on, if they just submitted the application without an affidavit with it, there was a chance that it would get returned, because stating that it would it would have to be sold as used. But they had allowed us to record the incoming mileage, which we have to anyway, for the purposes of the transport company. And so then it was fairly seamless, as long as we did that in advance.
Mr. Bile, this is Mike Downer. Does that then, has that procedure been honored and followed in every county that you work with?
In the counties that we've submitted, yeah, we're in El Paso County.
Right.
But in other counties, that it hasn't seemed to be a problem, as long as we submit that affidavit with the paperwork.
Yeah.
You know, the application for title and bill of sales and all those things.
I'm glad you came today.
Yeah, well, when this first came up, I thought, well, are we reinventing the wheel here? Because it seemed like we had a system and process, but I could understand that what you're proposing would actually be a little bit cleaner, because then it would just save people having to, by tribal knowledge, be aware that this is what you do.
My comment is this, and I am not an attorney, and I am not opposed to treating an RV motorhome differently than a motor vehicle, than a traditional motor vehicle for the purposes of the mileage. But as director of the auto industry division, I've been here 10 years now, and as executive secretary to the board, I pretty well know what the powers of the board are and what the powers of the division are. The titling of vehicles, the registration of vehicles, does not belong to the Motor Vehicle Dealer Board in any way, shape, or form. It does not belong to the division. That belongs to titles and registration per the statute. So for the board to weigh in on exemptions to their titling process, I have some concerns that we are weighing into an area without them here at the table that we maybe should not be weighing into. Now, do not take that I'm opposed to trying to clean this up in some way, shape, or form to where an RV or a motorhome can be driven from the manufacturer to the dealership and still sold as new. No, do not take it that I'm opposed to that. I am concerned with the board weighing in on something that doesn't belong to the board. And therefore, I'm concerned that maybe statutory change is really where it needs to happen. And I talked to Mr. Jackson, the executive director of the Colorado Automobile Dealers Association last night, and I don't know that we agreed or disagreed on this, but we had this discussion about whether or not this could be done by regulation of the board or statutory change. It has to be cleaned up. We have to, because like you said, unless a dealership kind of had this knowledge and this affidavit situation. Mr. Biles, is the affidavit signed by the customer?
No, but the documentation that the customer does sign does reflect the mileage that's on the coach. And also, in addition to the documentation that is for the purposes of the vehicle registration, there's also warranty applications. And the industry is already aware of this. And so we have in our package what is called a delayed warranty start. And that actually puts the warranty in effect from the mileage that the consumer takes, what's on the odometer when the consumer takes delivery of the coach, so that they get the full warranty period, regardless of what the delivery mileage is. And we've had some unusual circumstances that have extended that considerably, but that's so it's worked very well along those lines.
Yeah, so it sounds like the RV industry has found a way to actually take care of these situations with the customer, short of weighing into the governmental operations of everything.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because the way a motorhome is fabricated, the chassis portion, which carries the VIN number, is the company that builds the whole motorhome, excuse me, doesn't build the chassis. But yet the chassis is the number on that, which is the VIN number, is what the vehicle's registered by. And so when one looks at say a Ford MSO or MCO, where it says model year, it'll just have an asterisk, and it says incomplete vehicle. And then the complete vehicle manufacturer, who's a motorhome manufacturer, is who determines what the model year is. And so consequently, all of the chassis manufacturers' paperwork flows through, and then hence and one of the documents that comes with that is the delayed warranty start that is issued by Ford Motor Company. We do that online now, where it used to be a paper document, but it's done online now.
So, the point that I'm making is that in my position, I'm not opposed to an exemption for RV motorhomes in no way, shape, or form. I'm just concerned that we are asking the board to weigh in on something that really doesn't belong to them. It belongs to Titles and Reg, and they're not here at the table. And every time we do an exemption, the board does an exemption. What I'm concerned about is, you see it every day, is government fighting government, you know? And fighting's probably too strong of a word, but we see that through the legislative process. We get a bill in, and there's a big gap in it, and we have to attempt to fill in that gap by putting out what's called a technical, hey, did you think about this? Did you think about this? And sometimes the legislature then does a decent job of filling those gaps in. But I'm just concerned that the board we may be asking the board to weigh in on something that doesn't belong to them, so.
And this is Mike Gomerly on behalf of the APA. And Bruce, I agree 100% with you that this is a murky jurisdictional water at best. But let me suggest this as a fine line that we might be dancing here, which is new versus used is important for two things in this state. Number one is titling. And you're absolutely right. Title 42, subsection 6, clearly gives that title authority to the Division of Motor Vehicles, the title division. However, the Motor Vehicle Dealer Board, which has authority under 12.610, what section are we dealing with here? 102, to adopt regulations, primarily for the purpose of consumer protection, can define a rule to deal with new versus used from the consumer disclosure standpoint. And I think there is a very strong justification to exempt RV dealers from the 1,500 miles right line test that motor vehicle dealers follow. And from that consumer disclosure function, I think the Motor Vehicle Dealer Board here does have authority to exempt there. But I do agree 100% with you that for purposes of title, the Motor Vehicle Dealer Board does not have authority, but in terms of consumer disclosure, it does have that authority. And that may be too many angels dancing on the head of the pin. I don't know. But as I was sitting here listening to your concerns and thinking about it, that's where I got mentally.
And I agree completely with you. That was the distinction I drew. And I think that's why the statutory languages that provides in the definition sufficiently low mileage to be considered new as determined by the board. That is the purpose of that. One proposal that could hopefully alleviate and decrease the chance of issues arising between titling issues for the DMV and then the consumer-based focus that the Motor Vehicle Dealer Board has, is we could add some language at the beginning of paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 that states, and this is just very rough language, I'm sure it can be improved, but limited solely to this article or something like that, just saying that it's limited solely to the purview overseen by the Motor Vehicle Dealer Board. And that way, it really emphasizes that this information is solely to be used for consideration in issues involving the Auto Industry Division and Motor Vehicle Dealer Board. Additionally, the reference to Title 42, Article 6, 102 definition, again, that's just guidance. We're not using that as a statutory authority basis, because the authority does come from the definition where it says as determined by the board.
And my concern, just to follow up, is that consumer who buys a coach with 2,000 miles on it, sold to him as new, him or her as new, and all of a sudden they're then knocking at your door with a complaint, a consumer complaint, to say, hey, I bought this coach, it's supposed to be new, it's not, according to statute and regulations. And what I'm hearing is, you know, a pretty solid history of industry practice that makes practical sense in light of those industry practices, that there really shouldn't be a complaint there. I mean, there may be other issues in the transaction, but the pure number of miles should not form the basis of a complaint. So that's my thinking on it. So and bottom line is, I think the CADA does support the proposed change.
Mr. Biles, is 3,500 miles, in your mind, is 3,500 miles, is that appropriate, too much, too little? I mean, 1,500 for a vehicle that's put on a, you know, a traditional vehicle that's generally put on a transport and brought to the dealership, and when it's dropped off at the dealership, may have 10 miles on it. So.
Yeah, well, it's been the industry acceptance that these are all driven. I mean, just because of the physical size of them, it's very limited, even a truck that could transport them. So they pretty much have to be driven, and so it's been the accepted way of doing business since I've been a dealer, and that's 82. But what kind of brings me to an extreme is that we're not the only state that goes through this. In fact, motorhomes that are produced, say in Indiana, and they're driven all the way to Alaska for the Alaska dealers, and so you know it's by the time they get there, they'll have over 4,000 miles, and they're still registered as new. But now I don't know the mechanics of the titling process in Alaska. I do know that we've helped some Alaskan dealers with the remote deliveries, where the customer picks the coach up from us, but has bought it from a dealer in Anchorage. They travel through the United States, the lower 48, and then go north again. So I've had conversations with the dealers up there, and they've said, no, we don't have a problem with that. Everybody understands that it has to get here. We've, in the, gosh, almost 37 years of owning the dealership, we've never had an issue come up over mileage on it. Once in a while, we'll have an issue that comes up when you look at the VIN number. I think it's what is the 6th digit designates the model year, but yet on an RV chassis, there's no model year assigned, even though there is a spot in the VIN number. So we've had some confusion on that, primarily with the titling people. Either they will arbitrarily change it, or they may reject it. Now, if they reject it, that's good, because we can correct it with them. But and then once in a while, we'll have a consumer will say, "Hey, wait a minute, this is an older chassis yet." All the appraisal guys, everything else, don't differentiate one year chassis to another.
But is the 3,500 miles, is that okay? Is that a sufficient number?
I think in most every instance, that would be fine. Once in a while, you would have a situation, for instance, gentleman that couldn't be here today, he's legal counsel for Lazy Days. Now, Lazy Days has locations in Florida, in Colorado, and in Tucson, Arizona. And so it's not unusual to transport a motorhome from one location, for instance, in Florida, because their season is just opposite of ours. So they'll have a new motorhome that hasn't sold, during the season, but in the selling season down there. And so they'll transport it up to Colorado, for resale. So now we have the mileage from say, Elkhart, Indiana to Florida, and then from Florida back up to here. And so they would like to see a 5,000 mile limitation put on it that would accommodate all of that, the moving around and so on and so forth. We have had similar situations over the years that have occurred, and we've been able to handle it with an affidavit, but it is a little untidy, and it does take special care. If it were 5,000, I can't see anything that would exceed that.
I know when we thought about this, at least I imagined something at the Quebec border of Maine as a manufacturing point, or even a receipt point from Canada or something,
Yeah.
and then all the way to Cortez, as fitting within the 3,500. But now that I see you could have these transfers between dealers,
Right.
essentially, with the product, that is critical.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mr. Jones, does it have to be a set amount, or can the board say transportation miles? And then it's up to the selling dealer to provide Department of Revenue or the county or wherever the starting point is, proof of what the transportation miles were. So
Sure.
if they're 1,700, or if they're 4,700, or if they're 5,300, if you provide proof of it to the county that you're submitting the paperwork to, and it passes muster there, and then the state checks, double checks, does all this stuff and checks and sees that all that's there, and maybe that could be the solve. But I don't know if it can be that vague, that broad, that whatever, legally. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Legally, I think you could do it. Practically, I don't know if that is the best course of action, just because it would put a lot of more pressure on the division to have to go through and try to investigate and figure out exactly what occurred. I think especially considering that the Motor Vehicle Dealer Board and then the division have been enforcing that bright line 1,500 miles for the rest of motor vehicles. I think it's easier to do more of a bright line number.
And I'm happy during the break to run down and see if I can talk to the head of titles and registrations and see if this is a problem, if it's something that, if the board puts this in, if that's going to cause them issues or cause all the county clerks issues, because obviously the county clerks wield a lot of power in the ability to reject title paperwork also. and they're a unique bunch, so, and they all have their own ways of doing things, and some are a little stricter than others.
And new employees tend to look at it differently than experienced ones.
Yes, the ones that understand reality and the ones that don't quite yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm happy to do that on the break to see if that would cause a problem if we put a number, a serious number in there.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise, I think we could put limiting language in there that says it's limited solely to this article, and that should hopefully alleviate the problem. One question I had for you, Mr. Biles, is do you know how frequent it is in the industry that they move vehicles around? Would you say that is a minority or the majority where they?
There isn't a simple answer to that, and I'll tell you the reason why. You take a dealership, for instance, like I mentioned, Lazy Days, that has locations throughout the United States. It's not uncommon for them to move a motorhome from one location to another because of the seasonality of the business. is in the wintertime, you know, the RV business really goes into a slump here, but in the wintertime, in what we refer to as Sunbelt states, you know, Florida, Texas, Arizona, their business just booms in the wintertime. So it's not uncommon for a large organization like Lazy Days to move product from say, an Arizona location up to Colorado. Now, when that happens, of course, you've got the mileage for the transportation from Indiana, if it were manufactured in Indiana, from Indiana to Tucson, Arizona, and then season change occurs, and then it gets moved up to Colorado, where hopefully it ultimately is sold. So you can add quite a bit of mileage on it. And the one thing we hadn't talked about was that very often trade shows, the motorhomes have to be driven to the trade show and back. And some of these trade shows are a fair distance away. And so that adds, you know, additional mileage, yet it's still a brand new vehicle.
Mr. Bobs, let me ask you a pointed question.
Sure.
It's gonna come out negative, and I don't necessarily mean it to, but
No, I won't take it personally.
don't take it personally.
Yeah.
So on the other side, for years, it's been 1,500 miles for a vehicle. I will tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt, in my shopping for a new vehicle over the course of years, I've got into vehicles that had 1,000 miles in it, and it's not new. It's not new. When does an RV not become new? I mean, if we put just some kind of a figure on of 3,500 miles, I mean, the customer generally, when you buy something new, you want to walk in, you want to get in a vehicle, you want to close the doors. I'm sure it's the same way in RV, and you want that new car smell. That's the first thing that's so cool, to have that new car smell. And when you get behind it, everything is tight, you know. The carpets are perfect, the seats are perfect. An RV that has driven trade show to trade show and it gets up in that 5,000. From a consumer standpoint, is that new?
Yeah, we've actually seen not 5,000 at our dealership, but we've seen 4,500. And it was through a situation where the motorhome went from the manufacturer to an Arizona dealer, and it was quite late getting there, and the season had pretty well ended, and the dealer in Arizona said, I won't accept it. So the manufacturer drives it all the way back to Indiana, and then they called us and said, we have this particular floor plan that you were looking for, and we will sell it to you at a discount. So we took it, and when the customer came in, the person that bought it saw the mileage was something on the order of 4,500 miles. You know, we disclosed what had transpired, and they were fine with it, because the manufacturer of the RV itself started the warranty from that 4,500 mile point, and the chassis manufacturer, you know, they started their warranty from that point. And the customer had received the appropriate documentation, and so they were perfectly happy with it.
And I mean, from our standpoint, the auto industry, that's what we're looking for, is the customer that,
Exactly.
the customer has knowledge, you know.
And the thing to me is that was the consumer harmed in any way? Now, from another side of it, looking at it from a different perspective, it's had some shakedown miles put on it. And prior to getting into the RV business, I used to be in the electronics industry. And our infant mortality is what we used to call it. We'd have more things go wrong when it was brand new than we would after it had been used a little bit. And it's the same thing with the RVs. We see that something that was brand new, came straight from the factory, we'll have more fit and finish problems. you know, than one that has been in service for, say, 2 or 3 months.
And I just have concerns with setting that mileage too high, right? That someone will actually, you know, rent out an RV and it will be actually used, but it stays under that, you know, 8,000 miles, 5,000 miles, whatever, and then the customer is getting a used product, used in the sense of,
Right,
you
yeah.
know, lived in.
Yes.
Kind of thing. So I think we have to be really careful not to set that number too high.
Mhm. Yeah, inviting someone to do something nefarious is not a good idea.
I mean, I want to set it in fairness to the industry, but I don't want to set it so high that it, yeah, invites trouble.
Yes.
I wouldn't recommend having it unlimited.
Yeah.
But like we talked about earlier, I know that the 5,000 mile limit would cover just about every eventuality I've ever seen in, you know, the 37 years of doing this. And I know that Lazy Days, they did some research on this, and that was the number they came up with. So I'm not speaking from my little Colorado Springs RV dealership standpoint, but
Well, and pretty clearly, Lazy Days uses this as part of their business model.
oh yes, it's true.
And, you know, and we tend to try to be industry supportive of, you know, where we can, of, you know, that kind of, you know, advanced thinking. We're presuming, of course, that they're not doing anything nefarious either, like
No.
renting it out down in Arizona for 2 days and, you know, right. Okay.
Yeah, that really hasn't, you know, I haven't seen that as say where a dealer would rent something out, let's just say, and then turn around and sell it as new. I've seen dealers that will have rental departments where they will then, at the end of the season, sell them off as used because they were. And they were in fact titled in the dealer name. And I think that's one of the other things too, is that, you know, non-titled is pretty specific, you know, language. And so if a dealer hangs it, if they're gonna rent something out, it better not have a dealer plate on it. You know, that's, there's a lot of teeth in that regulation.
Has the division gotten any complaints on this new versus used in your issue from consumers over the years? You have, okay.
On
This is
RVs.
the-
On RVs.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an affirmative answer for those.
Yes,
that
it
sit at
is.
home.
Yes, it is. Yes, we have.
Thank you
We've
for
had a
clarifying the
major
record.
one, as a matter of fact.
Okay.
One of the things that this came up last night after I talked to Mr. Jackson. I went in and talked to Mr. Beebe about this specific issue, that this really, my concern whether or not this belongs to the board or Motor V. And so I think Mr. Beebe and I both looked at each other and thought, we should have had somebody from Motor V in the stakeholder group when we started discussing this issue, so that are bad. But one of the things that I thought about is, I'm surprised, Mr. Bosworth, how you said that this affidavit process has worked. I'm surprised that Motor V hasn't written a regulation to their own statute. And then I say that, I'm surprised, I'm thinking, are they working on one now that we don't know about? And so Ms.
On the
Rouse
break.
saying that she can walk down just to make sure that there's nothing, because we'd hate to have them working on something at the same time that we're proposing something that would be in conflict. But I'm a little bit surprised that they haven't addressed this issue with their own, because they're pretty active rulemakers down there.
Yeah.
I'm surprised somebody hasn't caught wind of it in the used car or the new car industry and said, well, hey, they're writing affidavits on excessive mile vehicles. Why don't we do that for our service loaner? You know?
Well, it may be the simplest answer in the world why Motor V hasn't done it, in that their definition statutorily with the lead line in their opening of all of their definitions allows them to make exemptions. And they may do this through an internal process. I hope Chris can find that out.
Hopefully he'll be in his office when we have it ready.
So for the purpose of moving this forward, CADA supports this as 3,500 and supports this as written.
Yes, sir. And again, with the distinction being, we're not trying to encroach on titling.
Right.
That is the authority, but we are suggesting for consumer disclosure purposes that the 3,500 miles would be an acceptable bright line for the RV industry. And keep in mind, one thing that I keep coming back to is the consumer impact on this. And the consumer, number one, the vehicle needs to be adequately disclosed. This vehicle was driven from Elkhart, Indiana to Colorado Springs, Colorado before delivery to you. That accounts for the majority of the miles on the unit. Number two, when does the factory warranty start on it? And does it start from with the mileage you delivered, or are those miles counted against the factory warranty? Because I was thinking about your example of the 1,000 miles on that car that you felt wasn't really new anymore. Were those 1,000 miles counted against the factory warranty at that point in time? Which is, I think, a significant consumer issue, right? So those are sort of the touchstone issues for me in terms of the consumer standpoint, which is really the issue that our board is always concerned about, is the consumer impact.
Well, Mike, would you, if the limit was lifted to a 5,000, based on the kind of lazy days model that Mr. Biles has pointed out, would that be acceptable too?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I have a question just on the industry standard. So
Sure.
is it your dealerships that extend the warranty per se, or is that industry standard?
They actually start the warranty and it's called a delayed warranty
And that's-
start.
That's
Yeah, and
manufacturers do that industry.
Yes, both the coach manufacturer and the chassis manufacturer. And there's documents that are included, with the packet that we received from the manufacturer, for that purpose. In the case of Ford Motor Company, it's just done online. We go to a website and we enter the information, the customer's name, the mileage on the odometer as it was delivered, as the coach was delivered to the consumer, and that's what they start the warranty. Now, once in a while, we would have a situation occur where, for some reason, the chassis manufacturer may not have recorded it. They reverted back to 0 miles. But all we have to do is provide them the documentation as to when the delivery was made and the mileage on it, and they update their records.
Is part of the reason why they do that is because of the length of time it could take a coach maker to actually build the coach on the chassis?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not uncommon. You'll drive by an RV manufacturer and you'll see just, probably 50 or 60 of these RV chassis sitting out in the field, waiting to be taken in to be produced, because what they'll do is they'll order a bunch of chassis and then they're all shipped as soon as they can. And then once they receive them, they basically store them. They paid for them. And then they're stored until such time as they've actually put the motorhome portion, we call it the box, puts the motorhome portion, onto that chassis. And then that whole completed vehicle is driven to the dealership. So it's not uncommon. The motorhome I personally own, the chassis was built in July. The engine, I think, was built around May, and the complete motorhome we picked up at the factory in the first part of September. So that kind of gives you an idea of the process that it goes through. And maybe I'm getting too detailed, and I apologize.
Actually, Mr. Biles, I appreciate you, we all appreciate you coming this morning. I need you to raise your right hand. I'm going to swear you in. You got a lifetime appointment to all future stakeholder meetings. So,
Or RV issues.
Come in late.
Or RVs are an issue. I have a comment moving away from the mileage issue in this proposed rule, and I apologize we didn't raise this at our first meeting. On the fourth line, under subsection 1, a new motor vehicle is a motor vehicle that has been transferred. And my question for Leland and Brad the question really is does has been, which suggests past tense, wouldn't that apply to every vehicle? And shouldn't that word really be is?
Yes.
It's sort of a lawyer's issue, that's why I directed it to the lawyer sitting up in the front of the room.
That's an interesting capture because in the OLLS current guidelines, they urge that we, where possible, place things in a present tense as a continuing act, and only where necessary fix it as a point in time. So the question is out there at this moment, is this something that is where we have to capture it as a point in time, or can it be captured in a sort of eternal present, which is?
And I don't know one way or the other. As I was reading this, that struck me as perhaps an awkward use of passive language, and we'd be better served by using the present tense.
Well, it certainly is passive voice, which is also discouraged. So that is transferred.
At this moment, I'm not seeing any issues with that, but.
With using is.
Correct.
Yeah, I don't either.
Yeah.
I agree with Mr. Don. I didn't catch it, but I think that makes much more sense. Because we sell motor vehicles also.
Yes.
Sometimes people forget, but we do sell a lot of motor vehicles.
And I wanted to, Mr. Aboud raised the issue concerning power. Are there any other comments regarding the motor vehicle side of it? Okay, I wanted to refer to Mr. Aboud regarding the power sports, and if you could state what you mentioned
Sure.
for the record.
The power sports products now are titled when they're let loose from the dealer. And we also have dealer transfers. So I guess it took a while to dawn on me, but the light went on, and since they're treated as far as transfer to a dealership, it's the same thing. It's the same issue. What is that vehicle? How do you characterize it upon a transfer from one dealer to another? So just being silent, I'm not sure that's the best approach. Should it be clarified?
And what you're
And this is Jerry Aboud with the Power Sports Dealers. Sorry.
And just to frame this better, right now, there is no parallel that we're looking at with power sports. And the basic reason that we did not is because that industry has a large set of vehicles with different properties, only some of which have odometers, etc. And so to facilitate a rule with mileage in it and things like that seemed singularly inappropriate, since we would be virtually guessing at standards that no one has made. But now Jerry's raising something of concern directly to that industry that has to do with but one piece, 4B, in the current paragraphination of the most revised rule. And saying that we need something like that to be its own piece. No, it's not parallel. It would be its own piece in power sports. Right?
Yes. I mean, that was the object of the Jerry Abood Power Sports Dealers. I always forget. I'm sorry. Yes, in one word.
Yeah.
And do you also have manufacturer certificate of origins as well?
Yes.
Do you have that? Okay.
Yes, it's exact, it is literally parallel now. I
So
mean, as
that
far as the
piece-
titling process.
Okay.
Except there's no issue of registration because it's just the ownership document, because they can't be used, they're not plated and registered like a motor vehicle. Otherwise, the sales process is the same
Yeah.
in that realm.
Yeah.
So based on that proposal, it looks like creating a new power sports vehicle regulation, which includes all of Part 4 under the motor vehicle.
Right.
Okay.
It might require a little bit of rewording. That would be, in fact, titled in the current titling system using the current title, the one we're operating under, the Title 12. It would be 1 CCR 205-2, regulation number 1260502, parent 11.
I think it would be paren 7.
Oh, 7?
Yeah,
Oh,
I think
because
that's
we
wrong.
changed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, parent 7, right. Right. Well, those gambling numbers, 7 and 11, too.
And then Mr. Dommermuth, I was noticing as I was looking at this definition of new power sports vehicle, and I turned back to new motor vehicle in 126102, and that's where we got the language has been transferred, was
Okay. So
directly from the
it's
statute.
right from the statute.
Yeah.
So my beef is in the State House.
Good luck with that.
Yeah.
Mr. Dominic, you enjoy going down to the Capitol on a
I
regular
do
basis.
not, Mr. Booth.
Well, not to be academic, but we wouldn't slavishly have to adhere to the statutory language there. But by creating a discrepancy, we could create an argument.
Understood.
Yeah.
Understood and agreed.
All right.
I think I want to take a break here. So Mr. Rouse can go down the hall and see if Mr. Rules is down there. And I don't know if he would be the proper one because he's so new or not. Dylan would be my choice, we're trying to get hold of him or not. Do we have consensus among the group that 5,000 miles is okay? I mean, obviously CADC supports that, Mr. Biles supports that. Is there any strong opposition from changing from 3,500 to 5,000?
I just still have that concern that we don't want to make it too high, and I guess I would say, is that too high?
I agree. It just seems like a big jump.
We're taking a break?
2 minutes?
10 minutes?
Well,
10 minutes, yes.
she's fast.
You might not be there, I may be
Do you
back.
want my,
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're back on the record. We are now, it's 10:19. We are done discussing at this time Rule Pair 1, and I guess we're ready to go to Rule Pair 2.
Or it's 3, I think.
3?
Yeah, give me just a second. Okay. Okay, this is Rule Pair 3 does have a parallel rule circumstance. So identical language currently for motor vehicle and power sports vehicles. Okay. In the original draft, paragraph 4 was a focus of attention because there was language there that I think in general people agreed needed to be removed. And that language, and this has to do with record keeping, right? Record keeping by wholesalers. And certain types of records would certainly be difficult to keep. And so the language that was removed, as it shows in the little bubble, is the language "or attempt to negotiate a sale, lease, or exchange." So the wholesaler in the new draft would not need to keep a record of things that were in that bubble. Makes it much simpler. The other issue that was sitting there had to do with the absence of the word "written," and more or less this is a cleanup matter. I mean, it's implied that the record is written, but in the modern era there are various other tangible or intangible ways to have them, and so the word "written" was plugged in. I guess we should pause here and say, does anyone have any problem with those changes or any concerns at all about those changes? Okay. Now, just as a point of technicality, all the semicolons were removed in this because each of these are stated to be each required. So it's not, an either or something like that. It's every one of them is required, so periods are the appropriate punctuation. So this takes us now to paragraph 5. And paragraph 5 was a major concern. Okay, there is absolutely nothing in our statutes or regulations that tells a business what business model it should adopt. Therefore, anything that would be a legitimate business model in the state of Colorado is fair game for a business person to choose as the business model for their licensed business. That includes the most simple of all business models, which is the one of the sole proprietorship. Now, sole proprietorships, as a tradition, operate, no matter how they choose, most of the time in the past, they have operated under the name of the proprietor. So Joe Bob Smith is business name Joe Bob Smith. This can create some confusion if we're dealing with certain environments in which people operate and are doing title transfers and doing other activities that may be deceptive. I'm not accusing sole proprietors of being more deceptive than anybody else could be, but it invites the possibility. So some of the attempt here in that red language in paragraph 5 is to achieve a combination of good ends. And first of all, to eliminate a confusion that can exist in the paperwork in a sole proprietorship where the names are the same. And by urging that, not urging, but by requiring that for transactions that are related to a wholesaler as a sole proprietor, that they actually explicitly say in their record keeping of their transactions that they are a wholesaler in one way or another. Now, this is not to say, the probably simplest solution of all in all these matters would be if the wholesaler were to adopt an independent business name from his name, which is always an option, but very few of them have done that. So this doesn't preclude that by this language. This simply sets up if you are operating under your name, then you must put that word in wholesaler somehow into the paperwork so that anybody would know, the consumer, not the consumer, but the other person with whom you're transacting, and the industry here who has to investigate. So that's what the design of the language is. Now, whether it is, number one, achieved its end, or number two, is still desirable to everybody, is the question. So, how about some discussion? No problem, Jerry. Okay.
Well, on the title transfer paperwork, there is a place for a dealer license number. So that usually is our first clue from the investigative standpoint. So this isn't necessarily beneficial for the investigative process, but I do think that it is maybe necessarily needed for the dealer when he is transacting business with a wholesaler to know that they are a licensed
Yeah.
wholesaler, or to understand, and for it to be clear in the title record.
Right.
But from an investigative standpoint, it isn't.
Yeah.
This is not geared to the title paperwork per se. It's more geared to just any of the transactional documents.
Yeah, we,
Doesn't help us. I mean,
Yeah.
Yeah.
it doesn't impact us, I should.
It doesn't
shouldn't
hurt
say.
you.
Yeah.
It doesn't hurt us, doesn't help us. We're
Yeah.
neutral on that as far
Yeah.
as the investigative process.
yeah. John, did you have any thoughts on
I
it?
think this, it covers it. I mean, the whole point of it is just a consumer, part of it is just something to differentiate between a wholesaler and a private party.
Right.
And I think this accomplishes it as well as anything else.
Does the industry have any? I see Jerry nodded to me, no problem. Mike? No.
No comment.
Nope. Okay. So are we prepared to actually say these revisions to this rule are okay to pass on? All right. Okay.
Should we stop at this point in time? So the power sports will be the same.
Yes.
So we're ready to go to Rule Pair 5, but should we stop to see if Ms. Rouse has any news from down the hall?
Yes and no. So the person that I went to speak with is the head of titles and registration. His name's Adam Wilms. He was on a conference call with, oddly enough, their rule makers and Dylan Aikanu, who's their legislative person, and they were talking about some rulemaking issues, and Adam was kind enough to step out in the hall and speak with me about this. And Adam does want to do some research. Adam does want to make sure that this isn't going to run afoul, that we aren't going to create title issues at the county clerk level, because, you know, there's 64 of them and they're all very independent thinkers. So he wants to do some research on that, and he wrote it back to me later today, hopefully, depends on how long this conference call lasts. But luckily they were talking about rulemaking, so I said, please make sure that you're not doing any rules that would be, you know,
Yeah.
kind of in conflict with this one, or that would really be confusing in light of this one that may be adopted by the Motor Vehicle Dealer Board at a future date. So, yes, I spoke with them, and no, I don't have any answers.
Oh, well, good shot, and it sounds like we'll get something. It won't necessarily be during the moment that this group is convened, but, which opens up kind of the question of, and maybe we won't close that question yet in case something happens between now and the time that we would close this meeting. But it will open the question of how we would want to proceed. You know, our timeline would be extraordinarily difficult to add another meeting in order to accommodate this information for this one rule. The options are to figure out a contingency plan, if you will, around what information might come in. That's one option. The other option, which I certainly personally would disfavor, would be to put the rule in abeyance completely. You know, that might not be the best idea, since we put a lot of hard work into all the elements of it, except, you know, and we could still use all those other elements in a contingency plan. But maybe we could wait just a while and see, you know.
Well, I think if this group is in agreement that, you know, the 5,000, is that what we decided on?
Yeah.
5,000 was going to be
Yeah.
it, that we should move forward unless there's an issue with titles and
Okay.
registration. If there's an issue with titles and registration, we'll cross that bridge.
Okay. We can do that. And that could come in at the actual, the rulemaking hearing if necessary.
I would hope to get the information sooner and maybe, you know,
Right.
send out an email to this stakeholder group that
Sure.
says titles and registration doesn't have any problem with it, we're moving on with the 5,000. Or titles and registration sees potential problems, and these are what they are.
Right.
And then we can decide as a group where we need to go with it if there are potential problems.
Okay. Sure.
My suggestion.
Okay. That may be the best resolution if everyone's agreeing to that. Okay.
Makes great sense.
Yeah. Okay, so let me get to the next rule here. Your type is much smaller than mine. I have to enlarge mine for reading now, so. Okay, rule pair 5. Again, this is a parallel rule with exact matching language between Motor V and Power Sports V. Okay, the group pointed out here a really important technical matter, which is that we need to keep consistent within the statutory definitions that we have in our expressions in any rule where this is relevant. And it's clearly relevant here that both, quote, motor vehicle dealer, end quote, as a defined term, which means new in our scheme, and, quote, used motor vehicle dealer, end quote, terminology, both be used appropriately in this rule. That's why you see in paragraph 1 that we have modified the rule explicitly to make that clear. And once made clear that that definition applies inclusively, then we don't have to change every other point in the rule because we have already stated it as a defined term in the rule. Okay, so then if the next piece where a change was made, and this one is really in response to the fact that it's the conditional language is not the favored language of statute or rule, because conditional language by its own nature creates the potential for argument. And if one needs to use conditional language, then it's important that the condition be made clear as possible and that it be stated as a condition clearly. So the change in the wording for paragraph 8 was a placement of language to set the condition up so that it says, in the event that an out-of-state motor vehicle dealer intends to sell new motor vehicle dealers in Colorado, then an out-of-state. So it's meant to be conditional and it's expressed as a condition, and unless I hear objections, we'd probably leave it. Does anyone have a problem with that? Okay. There's something that, was it Jerry that you brought up related to this, or not to that condition, but to this rule?
No.
I have something.
You did. Okay, Todd. Okay.
So I request the legal side of this. In 2, I know what the intent is for out-of-state shows, but because of the changes, and it's kind of throughout the thread, but in number 2, an out-of-state motor vehicle dealer may sell motor vehicles only at the following events. So what clarification, if any, needs to be put in there for out-of-state dealer to come in and sell vehicles at a wholesale auction?
Whole new thought.
Because that isn't the intent.
Right.
To limit.
Right.
Because it's currently, if you're a licensed out-of-state dealer and you register and you only transact wholesale at a wholesale auction, you're fine. But this,
We need to insert the word retail in some fashion.
Right.
To a consumer or to a ultimate user of the vehicle.
I think absolutely that's what needs to be done. But where? Probably in paragraph 2.
well, in 2, but then in 3, it talks about having to get a specific event approved if you want to sell. So I don't know if there's maybe just a separate number to clarify the whole thing. But that's out of my hands. That's in the good legalese hands.
Okay, before we go to the word retail, Okay, I mean, my conventional business sense is there's wholesale and there's retail. Okay, that's not a defined term, retail, in our world. It's a term that would be defined out of a modern dictionary. And certainly out of whatever industry standard might exist for that. I think we need some word. I just want to make sure that's our word.
Well, there are, under the definition of a wholesaler, that they can transact business only with other dealers or wholesalers. So maybe we can borrow some of that language to put here.
Yeah.
I mean, and so it's kind of consistent.
Yeah.
And this regulation has, in the 17 years that I've been here, not been a problem from the aspect that I see where Todd is coming from.
Right.
But it could be in the future. I get wanting to nail this down.
Yeah.
Could we just say to consumers?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the interpretation of, when you guys get a complaint, a wholesale buyer can be considered a consumer, correct?
But it says consumers does not include a purchaser of a motor vehicles primarily for resale. That's in the definition of consumer.
Right.
We could put a line in there, something that transactions conducted by a wholesale motor vehicle auction dealer doesn't require an out-of-state permit. Because if they're selling wholesale, that's already exempted under the definition of a dealer. The only thing that's not exempted is a wholesale motor vehicle auction dealer. So if you just put that exemption in there.
These are good ideas.
And you wouldn't need that on a power sports side because power sports don't have wholesale.
Don't have
wholesale
those.
vehicle auctions.
We'd still have to fashion something there.
Yeah, there could be. I mean, there could be power sport, well, not auctions, they're not licensed.
Yeah, they don't have that specific class of license, so it only applies.
And there was no
on the motor vehicle
substantive
side.
change, no substantive changes in the relocation, we probably would have addressed that. And we will maybe sometime. We don't have, there doesn't seem to be a serious problem for us right now.
It's odd how, we get ourselves into this thicket of specific definitions within our own scheme and then have to work our way around everything. I mean, it just shows that the scheme itself is complicated. And so, I'm coming back to where Mike started with his word retail, and it may be the best word. It's doubtful that a plain English dictionary definition of that would be controversial. Whether it would in some way contradict something within our statute would have to be looked at. Because it's coming out of a contemporary plain English dictionary, in the course of time, it could change. But if in the course of time, something that has been around as a terminology for 500 or more years is probably least likely to change. So, I think we could be pretty safe with that, but we could look at all these alternatives. Right, Brad?
So either add retail, add to consumers, and or add a exception or provision that says does not apply to sales at a or through a wholesale motor vehicle auction dealer.
Yeah.
I mean, to be safe, could you combine the retail plus the exemption for wholesale auctions?
Yeah, I think it would have to be
Yeah.
both.
Yeah. Is everyone comfortable with us massaging this a bit to get this into an improved state to publish? Okay. Are there any other concerns with Rule Pair 5?
Again, grammatically, and subsection 1, I'm not sure that the word which is the appropriate element there. I'm wondering about that.
Right.
Right after the word dealer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then again after the word and. And I've been consulting Grammar Girl online here, and she's not definitive either.
Yeah. This is a good break, though. This is a
This one's not in
problem.
the statute, by the way. So
This
I
is
did
problem.
know that. 'Cause I wanted to cut Bradford off on that one.
It's a problem word, and is a problem for exactly the reason that you want it to say what you want it to say and not to appear restrictive where it doesn't need to be restrictive, and you know, to be inclusive where it has to be inclusive. Which is a more inclusive word?
Which?
Yeah, which, I mean,
Which is more inclusive, that is
That.
restrictive.
right. And so I think, Mike, you hit a good point, because it looks as if we are intending restriction when we say is not a resident and is not. That is restrictive in nature. So probably that is the better choice.
Reads a lot better.
So for one, I'm 1 out of 2 for the record, for those playing at home.
If you're in the major leagues, that's Hall of Fame
Yeah,
now.
I should retire now.
Depends on the tucking fielding percentage or batting average.
Okay, so that change will go into both, obviously. And let's go on as I page along here. Just making sure I covered everything. Okay, so we're to rule pair 6. Again, a completely parallel rule, and in many ways extremely simple. The first change that you see in red is an attempt to recognize part of the discussion from last meeting around the terminology of posted and a modernization there. The word displayed opens up the opportunity for multiple display options, multiple visibility producing options, okay? It doesn't close anything out, and so it would be a more modern era word. I don't know if everyone agrees to use a modern era word or would prefer to see something just slapped up against the wall as posted would imply. This is clearly something that everybody has a view on. Is there any reason that anyone sees not to use the word display? All right. Then we eliminated a whole bunch of text that is too tiny for me to read here. And principles involved in eliminating that are kind of important to understand. First of all, it may not have even been appropriate in the location where it was. There were other issues which it could have come in conflict with. But one way or the other, it was a consensus that that was excessive. And unless we hear otherwise, it's gone. Does anyone want to vote for it? Okay. All right. So that concludes rule pair 6. Rule pair 7. Here we again were looking to include the two pieces of our world that we need to include in an appropriate definitional way. So we've got motor vehicle dealer license or a used motor vehicle dealer license. And that's consistently managed throughout the text. And that represents the sum total of the changes to that for both the two rules. Any problem with that? Okay. Then that was it for that. Now, just as I said at the beginning, I'd take us back to the the ones that we non-controversially agreed upon at the last meeting. And rule pair 2, which basically was a deletion of an existing rule, and of course, no creation of a parallel rule. And then rule pair 4, did anyone have a new thought on either of those? Okay. And then rule pair 4, again, a deletion and no creation. Okay. So we have basically completed the romp through these, unless anyone has new information, new thoughts, new concerns about any of these rule pairs that we have gone through. Should go around the room and ask everybody. No.
Nothing further? Okay, so let's move on then. So what we will do is we will wait to hear if Titles and Rich has any concerns on rule pair 1. If they do, then we will, the division will, and Mr. Jones will get together quickly to see what that is and kind of do an internal analysis, and we will do some kind of a blast email or get everybody on the phone, a conference call, something to say what that is. And obviously, we would have to, we can call a third stakeholder meeting. I'm gonna abruptly disagree with Mr. B.
Well, we can, yeah.
If we have to have a third stakeholder meeting, we have to have a third stakeholder meeting. We may be able to do that on a single, if it's really just a single issue this week, maybe do that telephonically for this group. We would have to announce it on the website. I don't see where that gets into the way of the rulemaking process because of, obviously the board has the final say at the public rulemaking hearing. Anybody can come into the public rulemaking hearing. Mr. Beebe is concerned, and I share that concern, is that we do have this limited time frame about when that hearing takes place. And as of right now, if everything would go okay, that hearing would be scheduled for October, the Thursday in October.
Right.
The day that is.
Toward the end.
October 25th is what I have.
Right.
So that would be Group 2 public rulemaking hearing. And we really want to try to stick to that goal. So.
It does mean that I need to upload to the Secretary of State's office within the next few days. That's the only hitch, because of publication deadlines. Yeah.
Do you have everyone's phone numbers?
Did everybody, first of all, did everybody sign the sheet? Did you ever get to sign it? Okay. Okay, and if we don't have phone numbers,
Well, what we can do is send out an email and then you do a
Yeah.
call-in number.
It's a conference call.
Yeah, it's a conference call set up. And that can be published online. That's what the DMV does.
Yeah.
you know.
okay.
Anything else before the group today? Mr. Boss, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for your votes.
Mr. Abood, Mr. O'Connell, thank you for coming in. With that, it's 10:50. We'll conclude Group 2 second meeting. To be continued. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.